So welcome everybody to the third event in our series of interviews with leading sociologists. And the idea behind these interviews is to kind of get a more accessible view of sociology and sociological theory in particular. The idea started from Steve and I have written books on contemporary and classical sociological theory where we deal with some of these authors. So this is a good opportunity to get a sense of how theories have been developed over the years and look a little bit at the social, political, historical, and biographical context for development of specific ideas and sociological thinking in general. So we will, Steve will introduce Professor Michael Mann, our today's guest, briefly, and then we'll go through the questions, about 11 questions, and then after that there will be an opportunity for audience to ask questions in the chat function. We will read the questions and try to finish everything within an hour. Okay, Steve, so.
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm delighted to introduce Mick Mann. Mick was, after graduating, he was a lecturer in sociology at Essex before becoming reader in sociology at the LSE from 1977 to 1987. From then he went to UCLA, where he was professor from 1987 to his retirement in 2015, just 6 years ago. His early books included Consciousness and Action in the Western Working Class, Workers on the Move, and the Working Class and Labour Market, which were very important books for analysing class and labour processes. But he's probably best known for his work in historical sociology, especially the 4 volumes he wrote on the social sources of power. This initially appeared in 1986 with the final volume published in 2013. And in addition to these very important books on looking at the configuration of power over more than 10,000 year period, he's written on states, wars and capitalism, on ethnic cleansing and the dark side of democracy, on fascism, and on the American Empire in his book, The Incoherent Empire. So I'm very happy to, we're very happy to have Mick here, and so maybe we can go from there.
Okay. So Mick, again, welcome, and we'll start with a sort of biographical question. Could you tell us how you became interested in sociology and historical sociology in particular? Because I know you switched courses when you started in Oxford and then you moved to history, but then it wasn't very clear trajectory towards sociology.
Right. Well, I went up to Oxford University in 1960 and I went to read law at the urging of my father. I did it for 1 term and then decided that I had done murder and also some Roman law, and I decided that was enough, and I switched to history. I'd always enjoyed reading history books about all kinds of times and places. And I got a BA, not a particularly distinguished one, in history. But I had a year, I was engaged to be married, and my fiance had another year to do at Oxford. So I looked and to see what I could do in a year, and there was the diploma in public and social administration. So I did that, and that's where I first encountered sociology, and I took to it very much so. And though I do have a qualification to practice as a social worker, I have never done it. And I did while I was just about, when I was almost finished doing the diploma, the department in Oxford was approached by General Foods Corporation, who wanted someone to study the relocation of their British factory from Birmingham, central Birmingham, to Banbury, a small town in Oxfordshire. And they asked me if I wanted to do it, get a PhD. And I said, sure. So I became a an industrial sociologist. And then I branched out a bit and did that little book on class consciousness, which was a discussion of 4 countries. Then I carried on branching out. And when I moved to Essex University, I found that, well, I taught a course in sociological theory, and I taught a course on the Enlightenment, which was a multidisciplinary course. And I kept 2 weeks ahead of the students, as one does when one starts as a university lecturer. And that's when I first really read Marx, Engels, Durkheim, and others. Quite early on, I was intrigued by the contrast between Marx and Weber in terms of their theories of power. And I developed an aspiration to actually combine the two in some way and produce a new version of power relations. And I wrote my first paper on that, which was never published in, I think, 1972 or something. So I was already seeking to expand into the world of sociological theory. And then as I worked on it, and I should say that at that time, the version of Marxism which was most visible in Europe at that time was that of Althusser and Poulantzas. And they had they developed the notion that a social formation had 3 main levels of stratification. One was economic, a second was political, and the third was ideological. And these had relative autonomy, though of course in the last instance the economy would dominate. And it struck me that that was pretty similar to Weber, except that Weber wouldn't allow one of them to be primary. So I was influenced by that. And I was also influenced not only by Weber himself, but contemporary Weberians, like Parsons' structure of social action, which is still a remarkable work on sociological theory, mainly on Weber and Durkheim, of course, and on people like Reinhard Bettendix, and Weberians, such as they were, tended to do comparative historical work, like Bendix or like Lipset. And so these were the kind of main influences on me, I suppose. There was one particular influence, quite an unusual one. There's a famous, now alas long gone, sinologist, Owen Lattimore, who was American, but he worked on China. In fact, he worked on the frontier, inner Asian frontiers of empire, on relations between China and the Mongols. And he developed a notion which was of how different forms of power had different networks, different boundaries, so that military striking power was the largest, but the ability to conquer and rule was more limited in space. And so you have the military with a wider range than the political, and and the economic economic integration was the smallest of the three in the societies he was studying. And you can see how that translated into the first chapter of my first volume of The Sources of Social Power, where I argue 4 networks of power have different boundaries, and so there is no such thing as a single bounded society. A concept which became more and more relevant with the development of globalization, because globalization doesn't destroy the nation state, it just offers different networks, important networks, but not those that eliminate nation state.
Thanks, Mick. Steve, you can.
Yeah, Mick, it's very interesting. You've given us sort of a context or an outline of the sort of intellectual influences. What about the political context? I mean, I suppose a lot of your work was being shaped 1970s and 80s. You have the Cold War, you have increasing militarization, the 80s, beginning of the 80s or late 70s, you have Thatcherism and Reaganomics, the decline of the welfare state, globalization, neoliberalism. How much of those sort of socio-political factors influenced how you would write or what you would write?
Well, one of them was very important, which was I was a member of the campaign for the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and I quickly saw that I disagreed with most of my leftist friends who regarded the Cold War as a conflict between capitalism and state socialism, and it was a mixture of economic and ideological features, whereas I saw great similarities between the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, and Greeks against Persians, or China against Mongols, or whatever, and that therefore that led me clearly to distinguish military from political power, which some people have criticized me for, but which I still think is a necessary distinction to make. And so that was a political response to the time. Now, the other ones, you've got to remember that it took at least a decade for the notion that neoliberalism, Thatcher, Reagan, were not just a periodic wave in one direction and there'd be a wave in the other direction. So in fact, I retained a kind of optimism about social democracy into the 1980s, I think. So that the later disintegration of the left in many countries didn't have a big impact on my formative years, on how I was seeing the world. It became something to grapple with, of course, but that was later, especially since in the sources of social power, I didn't get to the 20th century until pretty late on.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Mick, you already mentioned the influences, Weber and Marx, particularly in an attempt to kind of work between them and extend the Weber's distinction between class, party, status into these four sources of social power. And I wonder, I mean, there's obviously, you make that interesting link between class and nation as well. And nation is something that doesn't really feature much in classical sociology. I mean, it does feature obviously in Weber to some extent, but it's not central, and which is fairly central, I think, in much of your work. So how would you say, who else has influenced you? You mentioned some contemporary names in sociological theory.
Yes. Well, firstly, there were others writing at the time who were putting forward ideas which were quite similar to mine in certain ways, like Immanuel Wallerstein and the modern world system, though I disagreed with him. It is a single system for him, whereas globalization is a more multi-power set of relations. And also Theda Skocpol, her State and Social Revolution. My good friend John Hall, Powers and Liberties, whom I had a dialogue throughout. T.H. Marshall, on citizenship and social class, Barrington Moore, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. These were the things that were happening at that time, which impressed me, and I might disagree or agree with them, but they were certainly to be taken seriously. But I haven't really engaged with people who've been considered as major theorists subsequently, like Foucault. I found that most sociological theory became rather abstract and was not empirically based as the work of Marx, especially Weber and Durkheim were. And so I was a kind of I'm an old-fashioned theorist.
Thanks, Mick.
Yeah, Mick, I was wondering if I could ask you about your book Incoherent Empire, which I think was published in 2003. And in the book, you try to contextualize the US's invasion of both Afghanistan and also Iraq. And you try to situate this as a shift from a multilateral to a unilateral vision of the world in relation to the US. But you also sort of chart its decline, relatively speaking, in terms of its power position in the world. As I say, so that was published in 2003. How would you sort of update that? If you had to write a new foreword for the book, what would you say with the development since that period?
Well, I'd say, first of all, that I actually wrote it just before the invasion of Iraq, and I predicted how horribly wrong it would go, and what a disaster Afghanistan was going to be as well. And that was entirely right. I can hardly believe my prescience in that context. So I would say, first of all, I got it right. But yes, I put it in the context of this was no longer the age of empire. And it was now impossible for a kind of imperialist power to go in with its army, defeat the locals, and then find local clients who would say, okay, I'm going to support who wins this. And that's what the 19th century imperialism and most historical imperialisms have been. That is, you go in, and if you defeat the local rulers, then you get a lot of recruits to your cause. But the emergence of nationalism and also the persistence of religion, in the case of Islam, obviously, were things that made this not possible to do. And since Americans didn't want to be district commissioners in Middle Eastern countries, there wasn't the will on the American side for actual territorial control. So we can put it in a broader context. The United States has fought many wars since 1945. It has almost never achieved its goal. Korea was a costly draw. Vietnam was a stinging defeat. And since then, you can have tiny cases, Grenada, Panama. But apart from that, whatever the success of American forces in the field, they can't institutionalize their rule, and they can't institutionalize a stable government at all. So it's been a series of defeats. The most successful one was the former Yugoslavia, where they had serious allies on the ground. And so, and that's unusual. They haven't in general had that, and even when they did in Vietnam, to begin with, they lost. So America can't do these things. And Biden is kind of realizing this, but of course, it's admitting to withdrawal and abandoning your allies and all that kind of stuff is very difficult to do. So it will be, this engagement will be gradual. And of course, one arena is replacing traditional arenas, which is the Far East and the rise of China. And I think the United States is going to have to deal with another power which has more power than it in its own region. But we'll have to see if America will accept that. So I see it as part of a relative American decline not exactly in military terms, because the US military could, defeat anyone, but in terms of being able to achieve the desired goals afterwards.
Thanks, Mick. Maybe we can focus a little bit more on sources of social power. This is really your magnum opus. Much of your life has been dedicated to this, and has been published, since '86 to 2013. You start the first volume with the kind of theoretical debate, really engaging with functionalists and Parsons, and you mentioned that very much challenging the whole idea of society as a social system, and developing this completely new understanding of power dynamics, networks of power, from prehistory to contemporary times, and it's very unusual in a sense because it's theoretically very rich, and then you go and analyze it really with solid empirical evidence. So how did you decide to take on this enormous project? And is this project finished now with the 4th volume?
Well, it wasn't intended as an enormous project. It was intended as a single volume in which there would be the chapter 1 of volume 1, which is, I think, the best thing I ever wrote, which is such a long time ago.
I agree.
But it would have a couple of case studies. I'd already written an article, States Ancient and Modern, and I was going to elaborate that. Rome would be one case, perhaps medieval feudalism would be another one, and then the third one would be contemporary. Well, it grew and grew. And at one point, that single volume became too big. And so I split it into 2. It was actually my wife, Nikki, who suggested that. So I did that and published volume 1. Volume 2 became very large and tended to be, its core was about what you mentioned earlier, the rise together of classes and nations, the classes of capitalism and the nation state. And it became obvious that that was going to be a book in itself. And so volume 3. And again, at some point, I split it into 2. Volume 3 was partly because I had neglected non-European activities in volume 2, apart from the United States. So, so I backtracked to modern empires and carried on to 1945, and that was clearly a largest book as well. So it became 4. But I don't think anyone could start this with the intention of writing 3 or 4 volumes. And I know that Perry Anderson didn't, and I know that Wallerstein didn't attend it. They similarly grew. Well, of course, Perry only published 2 volumes. But, so I often discover things as I go along, and one of the things I discover is I've reached a sufficient length to end there and move on to the next one. So I didn't know it was going to dominate my life, my career. You asked if what now? Well, I've written this volume on war, which isn't quite done. I have had a general notion that I might write a fifth volume, but it would be more of a theoretical conclusion. Volume 4, I think, ends in when, 2012?
13, yeah, 13.
Yeah. And maybe there would be a chapter on, what's happened since then, but the main part would be a theoretical thing. And I have a couple of little pieces which could be part of that, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know how long I'm going to remain capable of writing books.
Thanks, Mike.
Mick, if I could sort of move on now to another one of your important books on fascism. In that book, you sort of look at fascism as something that arose in a specific socio-political conjuncture, particularly after the First World War, and the sort of upheaval that the Great War caused. But you do say in that work that certain aspects of fascism could re-emerge. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that. People often refer to some of the far-right governments that have come into power recently, very authoritarian type leadership in, US is one, but there are more in Brazil, etc. Could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on how aspects of fascism can, if you like, re-emerge?
Yes, well, they can. Aspects of socialism can also reappear, though I think that, traditional socialism focused on the working class is a product of a particular time and place. And we are going to get quasi-socialist movements in the future, but they will have major differences from that classic socialism. And similarly with fascism, there are obviously, living in Trumpistan here over the last 4 years, and in fact it's still there, threatening to take over again. There are strong fascist tinges, but some things are different. Fascism in the classic period, the interwar period, and before World War I, was a genuine theory of social development, social progress, using the power of the state to enforce knocking class heads together, knocking capitalists and workers' heads together, and producing growth, and also with a positive valuation of war and violence. And this was a theory, and embodied less by Hitler than Mussolini, but plenty of fascist intellectuals, and it appealed to a large number of highly educated Germans and Italians and others when Nazis invaded France and came to a deal with Vichy. People like Francois Mitterrand were attracted, as a young man, were attracted by the Vichy version of a kind of quasi-fascism. Well, today, these kind of extreme right-wing don't have that theoretical ballast. They simply don't. In fact, in general terms, they are very split on the role of the state in modern society. On the one hand, they want freedom from the state, and that's one of their central, libertarianism is a central part of most of these movements. At the same time, they want to use state power to suppress all those who oppose. So it's rather distinctive and different. But obviously, someone like Trump, who generally has no real beliefs except his own advancement and the kinds of, he opted years ago to go for the Republican Party. He could have gone for the Democratic Party, and who knows what we would have then. But people like Bolsonaro, for that matter, Putin, they appeal, and Trump especially appeals to the people who feel they've been left out by the development of modern capitalism and by elites in general. And that's a little different to what it was in the past. So I think there are fascist tinged movements, and Trump's is one of them, but they are a different form of fascism. In fact, I'm hesitant to use the word.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Mick, the other book that was published around the same time, and you probably worked on both of them at the same, The Dark Side of Democracy, has been very influential across different disciplines, but it was also controversial. I mean, in part, you probably intended that with the title, The Dark Side of Democracy. And you know, some scholars have been very critical, like David Layton, I remember, with the chapter called Man's Dark Side. And I wonder, I mean, where's this misunderstanding coming from? Is this something to do with people living in democratic societies unwilling to recognize the kind of the original sin of violence that has played in history, or is it something else?
Well, my title was provocative, obviously, in the sense that what I was actually demonstrating is that two things. The process of democratization is an inherently dangerous one. So, you know this in terms of the origins of the Yugoslav wars, former Yugoslav wars. And secondly, so it was mainly the first thing is about societies democratizing, and that's the time at which there is a conflation of the two meanings of the word people, the ethnos and the demos, where that occurs. That is, that the ethnic group becomes the people. So it's the conflation of the two Greek terms for the people. But the second thread is what you just referred to in terms of the origins and early histories, quite late history of democratic states that are democratic in their homelands. They conflated the ethnos and the demos in a more radical and racial way. And in terms of their colonies, they were extremely oppressive and murderous and sometimes genocidal. And these were at home mainly democratic, male democratic, certainly until the 20th century. And so those two things really amount to a challenge. Democracy is not a simple idea, and is not a kind of and poses severe danger. Now, the exclusion of the extermination of Native Americans from the thought processes of American political scientists is quite remarkable. If you think of someone like David Layton, was he simply not seeing the past of the United States, which was in a way going on until the very end of the 19th century, or also in Australia and the Dutch in the South Pacific and the French in various places. These, the ones I've just named, are the most democratic, the most representative forms of government back home at that time in the world. And I think that democracy is a sacred thing in the United States. And you can't speak against it. Not that was speaking directly against it, but against certain aspects of it. It's just unpatriotic.
Thanks, Mike.
Mick, you mentioned earlier on that you just completed a book on war. Could you sort of say maybe why you wrote that book and what are the sort of key hypotheses you're going to make in that book?
Well, like all my books, it developed. And so what I had in the first place was a couple of papers, one on, which had been published, one on, really, I suppose the core of it was an attack on Pinker, his notion that war was declining in the world, or at least in the West. I did that. And then I extended, well, I already had one or two sentences about earlier times in terms of war and the frequency of it, the long controversy among archaeologists and anthropologists about early societies. And I decided that to look at that more closely, I had to try and understand why wars happen. And that led me toward a broad comparative historical perspective, where I have two chapters on China, one before there was a Chinese empire, and the second when there was a Chinese empire. I have one on the Roman Republic. I have one on Japanese history up to the present. I have one on medieval and modern Europe, one on Latin American wars, and a couple on post-1945 wars engaged in by the United States, with a specific focus on the Middle East. And the basis of selection was twofold. One, they had to be well documented, so I couldn't write about pre-colonial Africa. And two, they had to have a variety of the incidents of war. So, and in two of those cases, China and Japan, there was a trajectory towards fewer wars. No, that's China. Japan also, Japan has great variations between different periods as to whether there are wars. Latin America has had very few interstate wars. And then unpacking the wars of the United States, there's been no decline there, except towards away from direct intervention and into relying on arms sales and proxy wars, those things. So it became big, as my books generally do. The idea is, well, why do wars occur? Well, I engage against political science theories. I mean, for example, realism, which asserts two main things. One, that war has a rational choice basis, where states calculate the odds of war and of war or peace, and go for what they believe to be the better based on rational grounds. And the second aspect of realism is that wars should bring success. Now, what I find is that the amount of rational calculation about the merits of war and peace is pretty negligible in most historical cases. You know, medieval monarchs, they went to war if they felt slighted. the ruler felt slighted, or if they sensed an opportunity. And somewhere across Europe, the monarch, the prince, dies without an obvious succession. Well, if you can claim some link to that person, you go to war. That's how England and France fought 100 years war, because their two monarchs thought, the English monarch and the French guy who became the King of France thought they had a good chance of winning. What they would do, they'd call out the feudal levy. They didn't know how many people were going to respond, so they couldn't calculate closely. They went to war with whoever showed up. Well, that's one kind of case. But it's also true about, for example, World War I. You can't find any good rational reasons why World War I should have happened, but it did. And this has led me towards a new take, as it were, on the notion that human beings are naturally warlike. Now, I refine that in two ways. The first one is that human beings in general don't make wars. Wars are made by small cohorts of rulers, right? And the general populace is not interested in foreign policy in two senses. They don't have any vested interests at stake, and they have no knowledge. And that's different to domestic issues, which can engage people. So democracy is quite a successful system in terms of domestic issues, but it's a non-starter as far as foreign policy is concerned, because decisions for war and peace are made by a small ruling clique, and they have enough power to be able to get people into the war to begin with some some support, though often only skin deep, and they get the soldiers there in terms of, the soldiers think that war is an adventure. And when they get into battle, they discover that war is hell, and they're kept there by different forms of coercion. So the reasons for war lie with rulers. And those rulers make decisions with variable quantities of careful calculation versus emotional or ideological commitments. So Genghis Khan tries to solve his conflict with another Khan by offering the other Khan his daughter in marriage, one of his daughters in marriage. The offer is refused. The other Khan says, your daughter looks like a cross between a toad and a bat, and I'm not going to marry her. Well, that's obviously sufficient reason for war. And it was, and he lost and got killed. And his Khanate disappeared. Well, you find the same kind of thing happening in modern times. Take the Iraq War. Why didn't Saddam Hussein say, I've abandoned chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, you can come and see, rather than pretend that he still had them, because his defiance was his main strength domestically. And on the other side, George Bush had had enough of 10 years of humiliation, the sight of Saddam defying the United States at every moment. Now, the war was a disaster for both. You also found, and I'm not the only person to have found it, there are limited studies on modern data, but I find it more generally, that those who initiate wars most often lose them. which really is, you can't square with a rational choice model of making war. The majority of those who decide that lose the war. Indeed, go further. Realists say that the main concern that states have is with their own survival, their own security. Well, in that case, why do the vast majority of states in history disappear? And most of those are killed in battle. So the irrationality of war is evident. So it's not a question of general human nature, it's the kind of nature of rulers. And also the very mixed motives that they have.
Thanks, Mick. I'm thinking now, maybe time-wise, we could ask the audience if they have any questions. And then maybe there is already one I can see here. Hi, I'm an academic, but not a sociologist. What do you think the core purposes of sociological theory actually are? What do you think they ought to be?
Wow. Well, what we're trying to do with theory is find patterns, of human activity, and to be able to relate things together, and to be able to, as it were, feed in a great variety of empirical data into theories, and empirical data on their own have little meaning. One, they acquire meaning through being put in them in a theoretical model.
Thanks, Mike. Maybe in the meantime, if there are any other questions, I have a question on war and nationalism. You are one of the few contemporary sociologists who has devoted a great deal of attention to study of both nationalism and war. And most mainstream sociology seems to be still not engaging with these topics, or when they do, it's not very historically done. So what do you think, why is this sort of reluctance to engage with these topics such as war and nationalism? Although that's changing to some extent, there are now people working in these areas, but it hasn't been traditionally the case.
Yes. Well, it used to be tremendously neglected. I mean, apart from a few deviants like C. Wright Mills or Raymond Aron. In the post-war period, there was a kind of mutual conspiracy between liberalism and Marxism to say that war was a thing of the past, it's irrelevant today. That was the general view of the 50s and 60s and 70s. So one would expect, I'm sorry, and though similarly, post-1945, nationalism became less aggressive, and it became, on the left, it became sublimated into development of welfare states, reduction of inequality, and that kind of thing, a rather social democratic version of the nation, which again had nothing to do with war. And then the nuclear confrontation was in itself very abstract. And so it was not so obvious that, well, conscription began to decline, so that the relevance of war to ordinary men was diminishing in the West, even though it remained highly relative in many countries of the South. There has been a recent revival, and you're part of it. And I think that the Vietnam War made a certain amount of difference in the United States. The wars that the US was involved in more recent times. But again, Martin Shaw's notion of what is it, of risk transfer militarism meant that conscription continued to decline, and war was something that was far away, and that was, so it involved dollars, pounds, or whatever, it didn't involve conscription and had little impact on the lives of most people. And of course, there are other things. American sociology today is dominated by race and ethnicity and gender and transgender issues. And that's what most young American sociologists are doing. So again, there's nothing about all that. I don't know if that's also the case in Britain. I don't know why I have a fascination for the militaries for war, like never having fired a gun. I'm not sure why, but it doesn't seem to be a widely shared desire.
Okay, thanks.
Mick, there's a question here from Randy Collins. He says, do you have an update on your analysis of climate change and the structural obstacles to dealing with it?
Nice to hear from Randy. And in writing my book on war, I think that his book on violence has been a very great influence on it. No, I haven't returned to the issue, so I haven't revised my notion. If I wrote volume 5, I would obviously have to do that to some extent.
Okay.
Okay, there's one more question here from Mary Gallagher. Thank you for this very rich talk, Professor Mann. I'm intrigued by your obvious interest in China and Japan. What do you think of today's China?
Today's China, has been very successful in becoming a major economic power, and shortly, I'm on the way to being a military power as well. Got a very repressive political system, everyone knows that. Its expansionism, I think, something that has gone unnoticed. Expansionism is all about revisionism. It's all about re-establishing the power and the boundaries of China in the imperial period. So that all of the things, the Uyghurs, Taiwan, South China Sea, what are the other more problematic one is the India border. But these are, though the Chinese refer to a treaty they signed with the British at the end of the 19th century. So they're trying to re-establish Chinese power as it once was. And there is a similarity in all of these demands, and Hong Kong is another one, that they're not totally new. They once were Chinese, and the Chinese fleets once dominated the South China Sea. Tibet is the final one. These all belong to China in the past. And so there is great legitimacy in China among Chinese people for all the demands that China is making. And though Taiwan is obviously a major risk, major problem, I would expect the Chinese to keep on pushing. And who knows if they will try and go any further than that. But obviously, in one respect, the domination by the American fleet of the South China Sea is going to end.
Mick, maybe I could just ask you, I mean, there'll be some aspiring sociologists or social theorists watching this. What would you suggest were the key texts in our discipline, things you would recommend for them to read?
Well, they should read chapter 1 of volume 1 of The Sources of Social Power. They should read probably selections from Marx and Weber and Durkheim. If they the kind of texts of my generation, of my period, were things like Esping Anderson, Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, Miguel Centeno, Blood and Debt on Latin American States, Doug McAdam and Alden Morris on American Civil Rights Movement, more recent one, Piketty on Capitalism in the 21st Century, Monica Prasad, Politics of Free Market, Charles Tilley, one of his books, Dodgeball, States and Social Revolutions. These are all, I think, models of the relation of theory to empirical data, and it's that blend that I think has characterized the best sociology and should continue to do so. So people may well have different areas of interest that I haven't had. Okay,
thanks, Mick. Do we have time for one more question, Siniša?
Yeah, the last question we have from audience, Anna Liberato. Thank you very much for your insight, Professor Mann. I wonder what your concerns are, if any, about the way Brexit, Trumpism are being discussed, theorized by academics, public intellectuals.
I think it depends what you mean by public intellectuals, but certainly the kind of political commentators in the United States have a fairly superficial view of Trumpism and not taking seriously enough the social basis of Trumpism and the fact that you have to do something about the situation, the economic situation, the moral situation of poorer, less educated people in the United States. I haven't really, I mean, some work is being done. And I know that there are many empirical studies which I hopefully are going to improve things. I haven't really followed Brexit and the like. It's you know, living proof of the irrationality of human beings, and in the disintegration of the United Kingdom.
Okay, we are just on time. Thank you very much, Mick, for this fascinating reflection on your life and work. And we will have this recorded so people can watch, those who couldn't make it today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so that's it for today.
Just to mention, Siniša, our next talk is on the 14th of June on Stuart Hall. Avtar Bragg will be talking about Stuart Hall and the work of diaspora then.
And her own work as well.
Thanks very much, Mick.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.
Okay.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.